Lynne. Oh, she's getting rigged up. So I have to look that way, not that way. Just in the short break time, I'd just like to say somebody was just having a nice little chat with Sally Kay earlier on. So in the lunch break, whoever that was who unfortunately got a bit cut short, could you find Sally in the lunch break, please, so that she can continue the conversation? She's just standing up and she feels a little bit concerned that she had to cut somebody short. So if you wanted to, you were that person who was having a chat with Sally, if you'd like to have a look. So we've spotted who that was, so we know who that is, Sally, so I'm sorted on that point. So I'd like to introduce you to the fantastic Lynne Booth, who we have known about for many, many years. Come on up, Lynne. Lynne is going to be... Lynne is going kindly filling in for the lovely Hagar, who is going to present on women's health. But you're in for a real treat now with Lynne, because we've known Lynne for many years about her vertical reflex therapy, and the experience that you have, Lynne, is amazing. And I remember standing next to you at the ICR conference when we were talking about possibly having a gathering, and here you are about to present, and you weren't expecting to. Thank you.
Can I have the... Okay, well, thank you. We'll just get started. There we are. So, it's a lovely surprise to be here. And what I did when Sue asked me yesterday, because I'm so sad my friend and colleague Hagar can't come, she said, would I talk about VRT for half an hour? So I thought, what should I talk about? Some people here I've met up with who I taught over 20 years ago. Some have not come across VRT before. So I thought I'd better give a little introduction, but then focus it on something. And two of the things that really thrill me in my work are working with sports injury, sports rehab, and also working with chronically sick older people, which is where the VRT was developed. So my two clinics every week are extremes of predominantly older women with chronic pathologies and super fit footballers or sometimes rugby players. I get an awful lot of offers to come and help me at the football club, I can assure you. So my theme, which I apologise for the rather minimalist presentation, which I was able to get from various handouts and other presentations I've got on my computer. So VRT is basically weight bearing, and that's how it started, working on people's semi-weight bearing feet who were chronically sick, who were in wheelchairs, and I often found it very difficult, this was in the early 1990s, to lift their feet to work the plantar. And so lots of people think VRT is just for standing, but it's very versatile. You could work a tiny 6-month baby who was just held on a parent's lap with their little weight-bearing feet just pressing down. I often work with people in palliative care situations where they're lying in bed, and you could put a book or a placemat underneath their hand and just gently press down. And we'll talk about how that works. Lots of people are worked on in a seated position for best practice or safety. For some people, they're standing. In other cases, I'm very keen that when you do work on someone, you give them lots of options for self-help. So you can give your clients homework and they take away some very simple weight-bearing hand techniques. So what is VRT? It's a very short treatment. I thoroughly recommend you do what I do with it, is use it as an extra adjunct, like a 5-minute addition or 2 or 3 minutes at the beginning and end of your classical treatment. So there's no question of you expanding or having your poor client stand for ages. It's very quick. I often give the example that once you've had a reaction from the reflexes, it's happened. It's not like keeping your finger on the light switch just to make sure the light carries on coming through. Once you've made that connection on the feet, then the body will usually respond. So weight bearing or semi-weight bearing is the key. and it responds very well with musculoskeletal issues, but it really is an all-encompassing addition to what you do. You can use it in self-help, but it's something you can sort of involve in your everyday practice, either on the hands or the feet. So it's adaptive for older people and with people with dementia. And what I thought I would do today is look at the two slight extremes of my work, but give me so much pleasure and so much enthusiasm. And one is working with older people using vertical reflex therapy on the hands, using the nail working techniques, which we'll talk about briefly, working with people to soothe them with reflexology and movement. So just coaxing the body to respond, even in those sometimes last very dark and difficult days for people with dementia. And the other extreme is the reflexology movement, the mobilization techniques that I've used on elite athletes for probably about 16 or 17 years, but also can be used on anyone, whether it's someone who does walking the dog in their 70s or a super fit athlete. And I was going to draw those two threads together in this presentation and just give you a few examples. So we're complementing the classical mode. It only takes a few minutes. I think some people think, oh, I couldn't have my clients standing for long. Well, thank goodness you don't. And you don't have to kneel for long. And if you couldn't kneel, you could work their weight-bearing hand on the table. If they've got good balance, they could hold on to a table and just put their weight-bearing foot on a chair and lean forward slightly. And the reason I believe that VRT does have this extraordinary response is because, and I get this from Nico Pauly, who is a Belgian medic, some of you know, teaches manual neurotherapy and nerve reflexology. And he says that all our reflexes anatomically, and our hands and feet, are desensitized. When they weight bear, they become sensitized. So if you take that analogy further, if we are stimulating the reflexes on the feet as reflexologists, they must have some sort of mechanism for alerting various parts of the body through the central nervous system. So if those same reflexes on the feet, anatomical or through our own modality, are stimulated when they're weight bearing, it may just give it a little bit more power. So that's the thinking behind it. So hand reflexology is just as powerful, and that, for my work with the older people, makes a big difference to how many I can treat and how they can be treated. Many people don't want their feet worked or can't, or they've got lymphedema and other problems that stop you working very easily through elasticated stockings. So VRT works just as we were talking earlier with Sally, three-dimensionally. The whole body is mirrored in the feet, as we know. Ingham had all the reflexes, the main ones, on the plantar, but she also had the zone system, which looked at reflexology as a three-dimensional slices. So my premise was, because I had such good results working with dorsum, we can, of course, from this stylized view, work the adrenals from the dorsum or the plantar. So the reflexology charts for VRT look more complicated, but they're not. They're just mirroring what we know and work on. So all can benefit from the hand VRT, whether that's self-help for mobility and sports people, for palliative care and people living with cancer. It's often the only way. Pain control can be helped through gentle weight bearing of the hands, and also the nail working, which I'll talk about. And any condition you work on the feet can be treated on the hands. So mix and match. You may not be very confident with hands, but if you were working on someone with sinus problems, and they had corns and athletes' feet on their toes, and it was very painful to work, then just for that one point of your foot reflexology treatment, go to their lovely fleshy soft fingers where the sinus reflexes are, and that will help them a lot more area to work, and it will be much more pleasant for you both. So with the mobility side, this is the connection between young and old. I work very simply on older people. This lady has chronic arthritis, very stiff neck, but she can weight bear her hand on her chair. And I've begun many years ago, when I discovered VRT, to get people to move as I held their particular reflexes. So if I hold a weight-bearing thumb reflex, as I might be there, I will get the client to move their neck at the same time. And so from the very early days of VRT, I was moving chronically sick older people, often just a fraction. And when I present at conferences, especially on sport and mobilisation, people say, how wonderful that you can take your sports techniques and help older people. And I'm always thrilled to say, no, it was discovered with older people, with the chronically sick. And I thought, if I can get results with these people, I can obviously work with anyone. So you can do the synergistic VRT work on the hands and feet, and again get people to gently move. We're looking at the mobilisation here. I work with a championship football team. I've been with them for 14 years, and before games, home games, I go and work with them doing a protocol, and I'll speak about the research, where we hold the lower lumbar and hip flexors while they're standing. So I'm not working the weight-bearing reflexes, but I'm working the body in a position of vitality, where I hold simultaneously hip flexor and L4, L5, and then I gently guide them round. And I've got a little leaflet, or if any of you want me to try the sort of spinal wrist twist, we call it, in our classes, you're very welcome to try. So sports people are always looking for that extra 1%. And so before a game, it's very nice to limber the lads up. So it was, not that I could. I'm old enough to be everyone's mother, which is, I think, is a really nice, safe way to work. VRT was discovered in the early 1990s, and we've since, myself and tutors have taught all over the world. But we're very much aiming at specific reflexes when they're weight bearing, only 30 seconds each. So this is not a massive, sort of long-winded approach to the feet where it's really painful and you're working for long. It's stimulating priority areas just for 30 seconds. So if you're working a bad shoulder, obviously you will work the neck, and you'll probably work the thoracic or cervical spines too, and you would target 3 priority areas. So 24 years I've worked in a medical environment in the St Monica Trust in Bristol, where they have 24-hour nursing care, dementia wings, sheltered housing, and extensive national training schemes with over 1,000 staff in various villages. And they were very forward-thinking to invite me as a reflexologist to work with that team 24 years ago. And that's where I discovered VRT when I couldn't stand people, stand them up, to get them on a couch, to put their feet up. I worked on the weight-bearing feet, as I told you. So because I'd done so much weight-bearing and movement work with these older people, it was very natural and easy for me to get involved with sport at an amateur level. And also the way in I had to the football club was by treating individuals who then told their partners, told their wives, brought along the odd footballer, until I had a few really good results. which I'll show you some of the techniques, and then I was invited to work with the medical team. So working with 2 medical teams in my 2 clinics means that we can always be challenging. Is this new? Is it different? Is it really working? How have they been before? And so sometimes I have bright ideas that come to no good at all earlier on. Other times, when I've worked with nails, which seemed a really unusual thing, we began to get massively good results. And I'll show you some pictures of the nail working. And the medics would encourage me. So from my point of view, we've already discussed the sensitives. My point of view, I was really thrilled when we had a major step forward after I'd been doing fairly simplistic movement with older people, although I had been working with agile footballers and amateur rugby players. This Mrs. GS was 87 and she had a paralysed hand from a fall with a lot of thickening in her wrist, and I worked her toes as referral areas. I think this is my late night presentation. I'll have to get back to that in a minute. This lady was having synergistic reflexology in her wheelchair. Let's just go on. There's a picture on the right, is her very thickened, swollen wrist with tissue. It stopped her splaying her hands. And I bent down, and while she did all her self-help on her paralysed hand, I worked her toes as referral areas, just pulling them apart and working them over and over again for about 4 minutes, back and forwards. And suddenly, her hands splayed open. And for the rest of her life, she died at 94, she could move. And it was so moving because she went to try and play the piano at once and couldn't. And her hope was one day I would get her playing the piano, but using referral areas, there'll be a picture later of working with cramp. If you ever have clients with cramp, and I think every one of us does, weight bearing the arm, just getting someone to put their arm on a dressing table or even their lap, press their weight bearing arm down, work round the referral area, lie in bed and work it, or in fact, if you're working with sports people, the guys I work with, when they're substituted on the bench in the cold, and they'll know they'll be cramping up when they're running, they'll put their hand on the bench beside the seat and then just like stripping the muscle. And if they do cramp as they run, they will grab their hand. If they roll their ankle as they're running, they'll grab their wrist and run. And I saw one of my ones who'd gone to play with Cardiff doing that on a television the other day. Really thrilled. So it's about it being adaptive. We're talking about people in hospital and children and babies. It's suitable for first aid, because first aid in our reflexology general sense, as I said, for cramp or anything, and for shorter sessions. Sometimes when I'm teaching classes, I say to people, if you're like my husband who says cobbler's children go unshod, because we're always too tired at the end of the day to give them a full hour or half an hour or whatever, then there are real tools you can use with this. So I would use the same sort of techniques. An 84-year-old woman a few months ago had fallen, fluid on the knee, so at a 20-year professional footballer. And I use the same mobility techniques, holding the knee, holding the nail on nail, and then getting them to move their knee. And we'll have a picture, I think, in a minute of that. So the nail working can be simplified. We'll just jump ahead. This is the complicated nail working that was in a book that I wrote about 18 years ago, where all the reflexes in the body are mirrored on the feet. Just as England had the 5 zones on our thumb pads and toes, I argued because bone on bone is so powerful when we work, why not nail on nail? So I've sort of isolated each system of the body on the nails So we can work very precisely, perhaps just targeting the liver and then working the liver reflex at the same time. But for our purposes, with all the nail working we do for the mobilization, we just use the central pituitary, or the center of the body. So this is, last night I had none of my new photos, so I had to grab these two, and they shouldn't be together, but I can't separate them for some reason. Anyway, on the right is an interesting picture, because this person genuinely had a bad knee, and I could work their weight-bearing knee reflex. I could hold the big toenail center at the same time, or I can take her knee reflex on her hand and obviously hold the nail at the same time. But I can't give her homework. So the great step forward for homework is you show a person a knee reflex on their hand, and then they just tooth on nail, hold that, and then they'll often get more movement. But I've got pictures at home where I've got this person lying on the bed, so you're not getting, I think we'll probably have someone standing, but anyone can do this reclining, so they don't have to be standing. The other picture here is that, again, we often do this seated. We have to make sure someone is only very agile. This is the mobilization for the hamstring stretch. Very specific. You relax the spine. You test them first to see how far they can go. You work very specifically piriformis, sciatic, and you get them to stretch again just once. It's the clinical precision of where you put, and then they stretch, and then you press once more. And we measured in a trial I mentioned that I whizzed past, but I will now mention without the slide, that we did a measurements, and often it was up to a 7-8% centimetre difference. And the slide that I was out of sequence was a very interesting 9-month research project I did in 2016 with Queen Mary University Hospital in London. The doctor at the football club is very interested in my work because of the extraordinary results we get. And he's also a lecturer in sports science. And so it's a great accolade for reflexology whenever we get research recognised medically. And the Ethics Board of London University passed a BSc dissertation subject in reflexology and sports injury. So the sports protocol of working the psoas, the neck, the hamstring stretch, the hip flexor, lower lumbar, all the things I do as a sports protocol, whether it's a dog walker very gently or an elite athlete, we put these into a clinical framework with measurements with all the footballers in the club. And that was a 9-month project which has been written up. Statistically insignificant because we had 11 footballers and 19 giving more information. But there's room, there were enough good results for it to be recognised as in there's enough information there for it to be taken further and maybe more research done. So this is the wrist twist. This is something that if you find me, I can do that in a second, and you just work very simply to get the reflexology and mobility, just freeing up the lower lap, which seems to actually reverberate up the whole spine. I used to experiment by thinking, oh, it's a thoracic problem. I won't hold the lower lumbar point, I'll go further up. But that has not worked so well. It seems that when you do a core sea change move, just using L4, L5 and a hip flexor, while the person is semi-weight bearing or standing, then you can get a really good result. So these are two people on a course in Hampstead, just practicing, and they're practical. But I can use this same movement on a I did the last week on a tiny little old man in his late 80s with chronic back pain who can hardly move and sits in a special chair. But I still held L4, L5 and the hip flexors, and I just moved him a fraction. So you can work in a very limited way and still give someone just that fraction more release and relief. So we're going to look at the nail working briefly, because we've talked about some of the mobility issues, but this is the nail working that, again, as I said, has been around for 12, well, it was written about 18 years ago or so, but it's been around since I started developing BRT. But it's the pressing nail on nail, holding to calm. So often if someone is in a very difficult situation in their last stages of life in palliative care, just holding the thumbnails nail on nail, or the toenails, the big toenails, can have a massively calming effect. And this is how you could mobilize the groin, by holding a groin reflex and holding the nail. So if you can experiment yourselves, because if you're working on a client lying down, we all know you work their stomach and their stomach reflexes, and they say, oh, my stomach's gone warm, or that hurts a bit. Then just do what you can see here on the foot. Just pinch nail on nail while you continue to work in, and it will often enhance and balance the treatment. So here is someone which I would not recommend unless you were very agile. You would sit to do this groin reflex. And what I do before the matches is we will test the range of movement in a player, or anyone. Our ballet dance, I work on a gymnast a lot, hold the groin reflex, and then you'll often find a much bigger range of movement. And they can, of course, do that themselves. And this is the shoulder reflex. So what I like to do when I'm working is to empower people so they can actually take away what I give them as a therapist, take away what all the BRT practitioners I teach give them, and then you give them homework to carry on. So it's the self-help that is important. Here is the cramp for restless legs. This is the diaphragm rocking, another movement exercise that I developed before BRT for jet lag and insomnia issues, and it's just rocking the hand. Again, lots of older people. I do sleep seminars at the nursing home for the residents who want to sleep at night and not doze in the day, and for the night workers and shift workers. So it's about resetting the body clock. And it's really a universal sort of application with BRT. You can use it to mobilize yourself, so you could do the wrist twist by just gripping the same reflexes. The hands and feet, when weight bearing, are exactly the same. And you can work on a subtle level, whether people are young or old, because we're just accelerating that innate healing process. And what I want to do, I've just got time, is to leave you with a note, a sort of thought that I shared part of what I'm going to say now on Facebook, which I hardly ever use, and with as much skill as I ought to, but I managed to put this out before Christmas. And we started this presentation with me saying I was going to draw in the two threads of my work in the clinics that really thrill and sort of energize me. And that's working with reflexology and movement with often very fit people, often people who I see getting fitter even if they're older, and working with chronically sick. So just before Christmas, only 3 days apart, I had the absolute thrill for me of working in my little Bristol City tracksuit in the medical room before a game where we beat Manchester United, which was the best thing that had happened in 50 years, and the roar went across the city. And I loved being part of all that with the rap music playing and all, everything going. So that was, that's in the, they don't play rap music once they're on the pitch, but it's very energising behind the scenes. And then my daughter does think it's a little strange for her mother to be quite so involved. But I have to say, what was the most touching, memorable thing that week was not Manchester United, but it was working on a lady with dementia. A year and a half ago, I worked on her. I've worked on her for several years. Very shut down, later stages. And she did the most wonderful thing a year and a half ago. She couldn't communicate except to mumble. But she took my hand and she worked for 5 minutes doing reflexology. And this is a picture, I got a nurse to take a picture with my phone. And she watched me, even though her cognitive powers are so low, and she had managed to absorb and learn something new. And she was a very caring person in her life, her family told me, and they were thrilled. And she did each hand, and she worked right round. And at the end, I was so touched. Well, she's now become completely enclosed and uncommunicative, and she's like a little ball. And just before Christmas, I worked her again with no sound, nothing happening, with her little gnarled hands. And she suddenly took my hand and began trying to do it again. And I was just moved, and I took her hands when she'd finished, and I said, "Thank you. That was the most wonderful gift." And she lifted her head, and her eyes opened, and she gave the most wonderful smile, and she just, again, held my hand. And so I leave you with that, because we must never limit. We don't want to limit someone who perhaps has musculoskeletal issues and can't walk far. We might have an elite athlete who doesn't think they'll play as well again because they've had a bad knee accident. And we must never limit what is going on in some people in the last stages of life in palliative care or with dementia. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Lynne. I'm the one very moved by that, and I'm sure you are too. Fantastic. Just the read from my colleague. Amazing. And thank you for the tip on cramp as well.